Welcome back to the deep dive. Usually when we sit down here, there is a specific kind of energy in the room.
Right, a sense of discovery.
Yeah, exactly. We take a stack of articles or, a new book, some heavy research papers, and we try to crack open a topic.
We ask how a system works, or what the hidden history of a subject is.
Right. And it is usually pretty exciting. It feels like we are building something for you, the listener.
Hmm.
But today, looking at the stack of transcripts and screenshots between us, the feeling is very different.
It is different. It is much colder.
Yeah. Cold is the right word. It feels less like we're opening a door to a new world and more like, well, like we're walking into a lab to examine a specimen.
Because today is not about discovery in the traditional sense. We are not here to debate a policy. We are conducting what we are calling a forensic audit.
A forensic audit. And that is the exact framing we need to maintain today. We are reviewing a very specific piece of media. It is an interview.
The artifact under review is a video titled, "What is Zelensky's Plan for Ukraine? How will the special military operation end?"
It was hosted by Joseph Stephen Rose. He operates under the online persona Expat American.
And his guest for this interview was Dmitry Orlov.
And before we even get into the mechanics of what they actually said, and we have documented all of it, we need to set the stage, the timing of this release.
The timing is not random. In the discipline of information analysis, coincidence is highly improbable. This interview was released almost exactly at the 4-year mark of the full-scale invasion.
Which is a very deliberate choice.
It is a process known as narrative consolidation.
For the listener who might not be familiar with that term, let's break that down. Narrative consolidation. How does that function?
Think about the timeline of a mass trauma event. When a war begins, the information environment is chaotic. People are reacting to raw footage. There is adrenaline. There is shock.
Right, people are just trying to process the immediate reality.
Exactly. But at the 4-year mark, the initial shock has dissipated. The cognitive fatigue sets in. People start looking for a finalized mental framework. Narrative consolidation is the act of pouring concrete over history while the event is still ongoing.
So they're not just commenting on the news. They are trying to write the permanent history book for their audience.
They're cementing the specific version of reality they intend for their viewers to inhabit indefinitely.
Which brings us to the ground rules for today's deep dive. We have analyzed state-aligned media before, but today the parameters need to be exceptionally strict.
We have to establish the language rule. This is crucial framing for the entire hour.
I have this circled in my notes. Throughout this deep dive, we will use the word war. We will not use the word conflict.
Because conflict implies a disagreement between two roughly equal parties.
Right. And we certainly will not adopt the phrase special military operation.
Or the acronym SMO. It is a war of aggression. That is the factual, structural reality of the event.
But the subjects of our audit, Rose and Orlov, they use the term SMO constantly in the source material.
They do. And when we must quote their exact phrasing to analyze it, we will note their use of SMO, but we are flagging it immediately. We categorize this as linguistic anesthesia.
Linguistic anesthesia. It is a very clinical term.
It is a clinical tactic. Anesthesia is used in medicine to block the body's natural response to trauma. The word war is sharp. It triggers a biological and psychological response. It conjures images of rubble, of casualties, of destruction.
It hurts to hear.
Yes, it engages the moral center of the brain. But special military operation, that is bureaucratic. It sounds procedural.
Like a logistics puzzle.
Exactly. It sounds like managing a supply chain or fixing municipal plumbing. It completely sterilizes the violence. It allows the speaker and the listener to discuss mass death without their pulse ever rising.
It numbs the moral center. But there's a secondary aspect to this language rule, the reality check.
The reality check is how this language functions inside the borders of Russia versus the physical reality on the ground.
Because inside Russia, using the term SMO is not a choice. It is a legal mandate.
It is enforced. If you use the word war in a public square or in unsanctioned media, you face imprisonment. The euphemism is mandatory.
Until it isn't.
Correct. The euphemism holds up perfectly in a television studio. It holds up on a Zoom call in a nice apartment. But the moment air raid sirens begin sounding in a Russian city, or when retaliation strikes hit a local facility, the language corrects itself instantly.
People on the street don't say SMO when the windows are shaking.
They say war. The physical reality of an explosion forces the vocabulary back to truth. Sirens correct euphemisms.
So for our analysis, we are sticking to the reality-based vocabulary. We are diagnosing a system of thought today.
Our objective is to demonstrate the mechanics of this specific rhetoric. This interview presents itself as geopolitical analysis. We're going to show that it is not.
We're classifying it as a case study in ideological cannibalism.
That is the analytical framework. Ideological cannibalism occurs when human beings, entire populations, are conceptually reduced to raw biological material or demographic obstacles purely to sustain the narrative of the aggressor.
To test for this, we are applying what we call the sociopath test to the source material.
The sociopath test is a diagnostic filter you can apply to any commentary on armed conflict. It asks a simple question regarding the speaker's priorities.
Which is whether stopping the killing is viewed as necessary.
Right. In any conventional moral framework, even if an individual supports a military action, the loss of life is treated as a regrettable tragedy to be minimized. But in the ecosystem we are examining today, you will notice a distinct pattern.
Stopping the killing is treated as optional.
Or even actively discouraged. Meanwhile, justifying the actions of the aggressor is treated as mandatory.
If the preservation of human life is discarded, but the reputation of the state is protected at all costs, you are not watching political analysis.
You are watching psychological conditioning.
So let's briefly define the two subjects before we begin the surgical dismantling of the interview. We have Joseph Rose.
Rose occupies the role of the expat dad. He is an American who relocated to Russia with his Russian wife just days prior to the start of the war.
He acts as the Trojan horse of normality.
He monetizes relocation content. He creates videos about grocery stores, public transit, and family life. For the Western listener, he serves as a recognizable, approachable bridge to radical ideology.
And his guest, Dmitry Orlov.
Orlov operates as the doomsayer. He presents himself as a detached intellectual. He uses the terminology of engineering and systems analysis to deliver eliminationist rhetoric. He frames mass violence as calm, historical inevitability.
Which brings us to Section 1 of our audit, the theater of normality. We need to look at the visuals before we even analyze the audio.
The visual setup is the first layer of camouflage. For the listener who is only hearing our voices, let's describe the visual data of this interview.
It's a standard video conference call, a zoomed setup.
Two men sitting in comfortable, well-lit homes.
There are no bunkers. There is no chaotic street footage. Rose is using a high-quality microphone. Orlov is sitting in front of a bookshelf. It looks exactly like a benign professional podcast.
We refer to this as the architecture of normality. If a viewer clicks on a video produced by a designated extremist group, their psychological defenses activate immediately. They see masks, grainy footage, perhaps weapons. The brain registers danger.
The critical thinking firewall goes up.
But here, the visual cues signal safety. It triggers what researchers call the Ted Bundy effect.
And we are using that term purely in a psychological context regarding the manipulation of trust.
Correct. The phenomenon describes how a predator bypasses social defenses by adopting the aesthetics of harmlessness. A cast on the arm, dropped books, a polite demeanor.
The ring light and the bookshelf are the cast on the arm.
They lower the viewer's cortisol levels. They signal to the brain that this is a rational exchange between two educated peers. Once that baseline of comfort is established, the viewer becomes highly receptive to the monstrous concepts that will soon be introduced.
Let's look closely at how Rose maintains this mask during the interview. He leans heavily into his persona.
He utilizes parasocial interaction. The audience knows him from his previous content. They have seen his family. They associate him with domestic normality. He leverages that established trust.
He plays the role of the curious student.
He performs investigation theater.
Investigation theater. So he is pretending to uncover information in real time.
Yes. He asks seemingly open-ended questions. He acts as the surrogate for the audience, but the questions are pre-scripted softballs designed to allow Orlov to deliver state-aligned narratives without friction.
He nods along. He presents the illusion of an objective interview, but he never challenges the core premises.
And Orlov plays the counterweight. He does not emote. He remains profoundly detached.
He uses highly technical language.
He speaks about geopolitical shifts and military actions, using the vocabulary of physics and mechanics. This creates an intellectual distance from the reality of the violence. The combination of Rose's warm curiosity and Orlov's cold certainty creates a pincer movement on the viewer's critical faculties.
It disarms you emotionally, and then it overwhelms you with pseudo-intellectual authority.
Which transitions us perfectly into Section 2, the application of linguistic anesthesia and the denial of reality.
We mentioned the refusal to say the word war, But Orlov is militant about this distinction throughout the transcript.
He actively frames the invasion as a police action, or as a proxy conflict managed by external powers.
It is about framing the violence not as a transgression, but as a bureaucratic necessity.
If you frame it as a police action, you automatically assign the role of legitimate authority to the invading force and the role of criminal to the sovereign nation defending itself.
But Orlov goes further than just renaming the event. He denies that the sovereign nation exists at all.
This is the denial of sovereign existence. It is a documented rhetorical mechanism. Let's look at the source evidence.
Orlov explicitly claims that Ukraine really doesn't exist.
He refers to it as a United States possession. He calls it a hot potato being passed around by Western powers.
Yeah, we classified this rhetorical device as the child's trick.
It is a profound oversimplification of reality. The logic dictates that if a country does not exist, it is physically impossible to invade it.
You cannot violate the sovereignty of a void.
Exactly. It systematically strips the victim of their right to be recognized as a victim.
And he attempts to back this up with historical erasure.
He claims that the people living there are simply Russians with a regional accent.
Or he uses this phrase, he calls them weird tribes from the hills.
The phrasing is intentionally reductive and colonial. It erases distinct historical identity. The Orwellian parallel is clear here. The erasure of history precedes the erasure of rights. If a population is reduced to a weird tribe, or merely citizens with a regional accent, then military intervention is reframed as a domestic administrative correction.
It turns a campaign of conquest into a disciplinary action against a rogue province.
Which is the necessary psychological precursor for what comes next.
Right, because once you erase their history, you can start erasing their humanity. This brings us to Section 3, the core of the rhetoric, dehumanization.
This section requires strict analytical detachment because the vocabulary utilized in the source material is deeply disturbing.
This is where the sociopath test yields its clearest results. Listen to the specific nouns Orlov chooses when describing the population. He does not use the words citizens or soldiers.
He refers to them as rats, specifically rats in the rafters.
We need to unpack the utility of that specific animalistic analogy. Why rats?
A rat is universally understood as vermin. It is a vector for disease. But fundamentally, in the context of a structure, a rat is an invader.
In the rafters implies they have infested a home.
Yes. It implies they are occupying a space where they do not legally or naturally belong. And the protocol for dealing with an infestation is not negotiation.
It is extermination.
In Gregory Stanton's recognized framework, the 10 stages of genocide, dehumanization is a critical stage. By equating human beings with vermin, the speaker successfully removes the psychological barrier to mass killing.
It effectively inverts the moral weight of the act.
Slaying a human being is recognized by the brain as murder. Eradicating a rat is recognized as hygiene.
If the audience accepts the premise that the targets are vermin, then the soldiers pulling the trigger are no longer viewed as killers. They're viewed as cleaners.
It offers the viewer permission to observe mass casualties without experiencing moral fatigue or guilt.
But the vocabulary gets even more clinical. Orlov uses another phrase to describe the male population of the country.
He refers to them as sperm banks.
He is talking about the freezing of genetic material. But the way he applies the term is entirely reductive.
It reduces the entire demographic to biological inventory. They are stripped of agency, of identity, and of humanity. They are merely genetic material to be managed, harvested, or neutralized by the system.
And this biological framing leads directly into pseudoscience.
The biological determinism segment of the interview, this reveals the eliminationist core of the rhetoric beneath the detached intellectual mask.
Orlov makes claims about the genetics of neighboring countries.
He asserts that populations in Poland, Finland, and Estonia possess a genetic flaw. He specifically references an issue with their Y chromosome.
He claims this makes them biologically anti-Russian.
Let's categorize this accurately. This is not geopolitical analysis. This is eugenics.
He is arguing that political opposition is not based on historical grievances. It is not about borders or policy.
He is stating it is inherent in their DNA. It is a biological inevitability.
And the logical conclusion of that premise is terrifying.
If the opposition is encoded in the genetics of population, it cannot be resolved through diplomacy. It cannot be negotiated away. The only permanent solution to a genetic threat is the removal of the genetics.
It is the justification for permanent total hostility.
Yes. And this intense dehumanization is also hyper-focused on the leadership.
The targeting of Zelensky in the interview is visceral.
Orlov uses highly personalized vitriol. He refers to him as a cokehead. He focuses on physical degradation, mentioning a dissolved nasal septum.
But he also integrates specific historical prejudices.
He leans into established anti-Semitic tropes. He acknowledges Zelensky's Jewish heritage, but simultaneously claims that Zelensky fundamentally hates Ukrainians and is intentionally sending them to slaughter.
This is a textbook example of moral inversion.
The structural reality is that the invading force is launching the munitions. Yet through this rhetorical inversion, the aggressor is framed as a reluctant disciplinarian, while the leader of the defending nation is framed as the actual butcher.
Orlov literally claims that Zelensky has killed over 1 million of them.
The guilt for the violence is entirely transferred from the hand that drops the bomb to the hand that refuses to capitulate. It mirrors the logic of domestic abuse. The aggressor insists the victim force their hand.
Which perfectly sets up their justification for escalating the violence. Let's move to Section 4. Violence as discipline.
Because the rhetoric does not merely excuse the violence, it embraces it as a pedagogical tool.
They discuss what we call the slap theory.
Orlov states explicitly that Europe needs to be slapped and slapped really hard.
And he is not speaking metaphorically about economic sanctions.
He immediately escalates the concept to maximum kinetic force. He references Sergei Karganov.
For context, Karganov is a prominent Russian policy intellectual who has publicly advocated for preemptive nuclear strikes on European cities.
To sober up the West, that is the rationale. Orlov integrates this proposal into the interview as a rational, viable option. He casually discusses the prospect of nuclear detonations over Berlin or London.
He also goes into granular detail about the Orechnik missile system.
He describes the kinetic energy of the weapon. He details how it pulverizes concrete, how it generates localized earthquakes. The tone is almost reverent.
We categorize this as sadism, as pedagogy.
They do not view mass destruction as a tragic last resort of national defense. They view it as a necessary instrument to teach a lesson.
To discipline unruly subordinates.
It relies on a strict hierarchy. The West, or Ukraine, are framed as disobedient children. Russia is the stern parental figure. The violence is reframed as tough love.
But while they project this image of supreme paternal control, they simultaneously cultivate a deep fear of the victims they are destroying.
This is a fascinating operational paradox. They want to discipline the West, but they also deploy predictive propaganda to terrify the European audience.
Orlov makes a specific prediction about refugees.
He predicts that as the Ukrainian state collapses, huge armed gangs of Ukrainians will flood into Europe.
He specifically says they will be raping and pillaging.
We must apply the mirror rule of propaganda analysis here.
The mirror rule dictates that whatever an entity forcefully accuses its adversary of doing, it is frequently a projection of its own actions or intentions.
We have extensive documented evidence from international monitoring bodies regarding sexual violence and systematic looting conducted by Russian forces in occupied territories.
By projecting these exact crimes onto the victims, projecting them into the future as a threat to Europe, the rhetoric serves a highly specific function.
It is designed to sever the empathy of the Western public.
If you convince a population that the refugees fleeing a war zone are actually latent criminals who will victimize them,
the humanitarian impulse evaporates. It is replaced by self-preservation and hostility. The audience is conditioned to view the abandonment or even the destruction of the victim as a preventative security measure.
it is a calculated severing of international solidarity.
Which requires establishing absolute moral supremacy. That brings us to Section 5, Moral Inversion and the Satanic West.
This segment of the transcript deviates from military matters entirely. They enter what we call the conspiracy loop.
Rose and Orlov dedicate a significant portion of the interview to discussing the leadership of the West. They describe it as being controlled by satanic pedophiles.
They explicitly bring up the Jeffrey Epstein network. They talk about negative systems running global affairs.
The sudden introduction of Epstein into a discussion about Eastern European geopolitics might seem erratic, but it is a functional requirement of the narrative structure.
Why is it necessary?
It creates a binary of absolute moral extremes. If the adversary of the West is not just politically opposed, but literally satanic and actively preying on children, then the moral calculus changes completely.
Because you cannot compromise with absolute evil.
And more importantly, any violence committed against absolute evil is inherently justified. It is sanctified. If you are fighting demons, the concept of a war crime ceases to exist. It is no longer a military campaign. It is an exorcism.
Orlov pairs this with an interesting logical twist, the incompetence paradox.
He claims that these devil worshippers attempted to depopulate the globe using vaccines, but they failed because they're fundamentally incompetent.
This is a staple of fascist rhetoric, isn't it?
Yes, the enemy must be portrayed as simultaneously an omnipotent existential threat that requires total mobilization to defeat, and a pathetic, incompetent failure that is easily crushed.
And throughout this segment, Rose's role is critical.
Rose provides the validation. He is the Westerner confirming the corruption of the West.
He nods along. He agrees that the West is irredeemable.
They utilize the metaphor of Noah's Ark. They frame Russia as the final refuge, preserving traditional human values from the flood of Western degeneracy.
Rose acts as the living testament to this claim. He suggests he fled the dirty West to find purity and safety in the clean East.
But his presence in Moscow and his ability to produce this media brings us to the most vital context of this deep dive, Section 6, the structural reality.
We have to analyze the environment in which this interview was produced. We are looking at operations inside a mafia state.
We use the house metaphor to illustrate this structural reality.
Let's outline the house metaphor for the audience.
Imagine the state structure as a house. Rose produces his content exclusively in the living room. It is well appointed. The heating is inexpensive. There are nice bookshelves. He films a birthday party and says, "Look, the house is normal. The house is safe."
But the house has a basement.
The basement is the unacknowledged reality of the system.
It is where the Zindans are located.
Zindans are the underground punishment pits used by the military to torture their own insubordinate personnel.
The basement is where the meat assaults are coordinated, sending waves of under-equipped infantry forward simply to expose enemy firing positions.
It is where political dissidents are processed. It is where the rule of law is suspended.
Rose never shows the basement.
He cannot acknowledge the basement. If he does, his utility to the state vanishes and his protection is revoked.
This is the protection racket.
Rose operates a business relocating Westerners to Russia. In an authoritarian system currently engaged in a massive war, an expatriate does not operate an international media and logistics business without the explicit tolerance of the state security apparatus.
The tolerance is not free.
It is a transaction. Rose's rent for his visa, his lifestyle, and his safety in Moscow is the production of this precise alignment.
He is a willing participant. He filters the reality of the war to protect his own social and legal standing.
Which explains the glaring omissions in the interview. It explains the absence of accountability.
Applying the sociopath test again. Look at what is completely missing from an hour-long discussion about a massive war.
There is zero criticism of the state leadership. There is zero acknowledgement of the staggering casualty figures suffered by Russian forces. There is absolutely no demand for a cessation of hostilities.
It operates entirely on the mafia code.
Loyalty replaces legality. The courts function as procedural theater. Corruption and extreme rhetoric are tolerated, even rewarded, provided the individual displays absolute obedience to the central narrative.
As long as Rose and Orlov maintain that the West is satanic and Russia is the righteous disciplinarian, they enjoy total impunity.
Impunity flows downward from power, but only to those who service the machine.
Which leads to the final narrative they are mandated to service. Section 7. The Doom Prophecy.
This is Orlov's primary utility. He is deployed to deliver predictive propaganda.
He built his initial audience predicting the collapse of the United States. In this interview, he expands the collapse narrative.
He confidently predicts the literal extinction of the German and French populations. He frames it as a biological and demographic certainty.
But analytically, there is a massive logical fallacy at the center of this argument.
A glaring contradiction. If the Western world is inevitably collapsing under its own weight, if its populations are going extinct and its economies are failing,
then why does it present an existential threat?
Exactly. Why must a robust, superior state launch a massive, costly invasion to defend itself against a dying patient?
The logic fails, but the psychology behind it is highly effective.
The purpose of the doom prophecy is not to provide accurate forecasting. The objective is to breed passivity.
Passivity in the Western listener.
If the audience is convinced that Ukraine is finished, which is exactly how Rose phrases it in his promotional material, and that Europe is destined for demographic collapse regardless of what anyone does,
then taking action is pointless.
Why send aid? Why protest? Why care? It frames the aggression not as a crime that can be stopped, but as a historical tide that must simply be accepted. It encourages the listener to surrender their agency.
And it is paired with the mythology of the aggressor state.
Orlov invokes the concept of the phoenix of empires. He claims the state dies and rises again stronger each time.
But the reality of this phoenix is entirely parasitic.
The rebirth they describe requires the consumption of neighboring nations. The destruction of Ukrainian sovereignty is justified as necessary fuel for this imperial resurrection.
So we have dismantled the artifact. Let's move to the outro and summarize the findings. The verdict.
The forensic audit yields a definitive conclusion. This interview was not an exchange of ideas between independent thinkers.
It was a synchronized display of ideological cannibalism.
They systematically failed the sociopath test. The preservation of life was never prioritized. The justification of mass violence was the sole objective.
They dehumanized the victims, reducing them to vermin and genetic material. They inverted morality, framing the targets as satanic to excuse their annihilation.
And they operated within a structure of transactional impunity, shielding themselves from the reality of the violence they advocate.
So the takeaway for you, the listener, is the necessity of digital resilience.
You must recognize the architecture of normality. Do not let the calm tone, the professional microphones, or the expat dad persona bypass your critical thinking.
The invitation they offer to help you understand the situation through their perspective is a trap.
It is an invitation to accept that certain populations are disposable.
Which brings us to our final thought, the boundary of reality.
Language is a powerful tool for manipulation. But reality always corrects language.
They can sit in comfortable chairs and call it a special military operation. They can theorize about demographic collapse and genetic inevitability.
But sirens correct euphemisms.
Rubble corrects ideology.
And war, no matter how relentlessly it is renamed by those who profit from it, remains war.
The file is closed. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We will see you next time.